Jackson Center is celebrating its 20th anniversary. And one of the early recollections I have of is you raising your hand and talking to me about your relationship in Germany.
Deutschland, oh alles.
Yes. And ultimately that led to you making a presentation at one of our earliest Jackson Society meetings about a trip to Nuremberg.
I was in the basement.
Yeah.
And I had to follow John Barrett. I didn't like following him. He's such a great speaker. But I remember that.
Yes. And you talked about a potential upcoming trip, which turned out to be magnificent. So I always was, I didn't know that I ever really asked specifically, why does Warren Erickson, a good Swede, have such a close relationship to folks in Germany, especially in the Nuremberg area?
I'll tell you, I don't want to tell everybody.
Yeah.
I went to college. And we had the required courses, and then we had some electives. One was an elective of language, so I took German. And I've normally done pretty good in school, except I flunked freshman German. And I said, this can't be. So I went to summer school, and I got an A. I didn't really work that hard during the semester, or the school year. But I said at that point, you know, I sort of enjoyed that language. And I thought, someday, a dreamer, I'd like to learn German, Swedish, and Italian, thinking it would be simple. Well, a lot of years went by before I felt I had the time and the money just to take off and go to school. Mm-hmm. And by that time, I had a client that had turned out to be a friend, an American, who immigrated to Germany. And he visited me every year. Not professionally, just visited. He was in timber, and we had the land out in Sherman. Mm-hmm. And he eventually joined me in buying some more land in Sherman. And once he said, you know, you've been talking about learning German. And this fellow spoke English, German, Polish, Croatian, and Russian, and American. I found a place where you can learn German. There has a school named the Goethe Institute. Yeah. They have classes all over the world. So a few years later, I signed up for it. And it was 5 weeks. I was at Beauport am Rhein. Nice little village. Developed a friendship with a lady there that eventually helped us with the Jackson Center, and I don't even know if you know about this. And the next year I went to Rothenburg ob der Tauber, which is about 45 kilometers away from Nuremberg. Why don't you go play golf? She got sort of mad at me. And the golf club was towards Nuremberg. So I went, and in Germany, if you have a handicap and have a club relationship, you can play at any course in Germany. Ah. So I went and I got there 7 o'clock-ish, and it wasn't opened yet. They have a little honor system, a little box. Just put your money in, and when you come back in, just sign up so we know you've been here. So I went out, I'm by myself. I played the first hole, and I looked back, and there's a single guy coming. And I was always trying to speak with Germans. So I slowed down, and when he finished the first hole, I said, I'm a student, I'm learning German, can we play together? He spoke English to me. Yes, we can do that. That was Wolfgang.
I'll be darned.
So,
I'll be darned.
Yeah, we played the 18 holes, and they had a clubhouse. We went in, and he bought me a beer, and he had a beer, and we made arrangements that I would contact him again. We'd do it the following year, which happened. And it happened many years. One year, Joan and Bill Reed were there. Bill played golf with us, and Joan played golf, Wolfgang and me. So we were just doing things in the Nuremberg area on occasion.
Right.
Then one year, I was escorting a couple, and we went, of course, to the courthouse, and Wolfgang said, have you been to the document center? No. Sounds like a library. I haven't been there. So he said, we'll go there. The document center you have learned about, it was like a museum. And as I told you and Raleigh, I wanted to call you from Germany to tell you about this place, thinking, and Betty said, what do you want to do that for? I said, the plane might crash. And then Greg will never know about this. And that's serious. I was that excited. And, but I didn't call you, but we got back, and you got us together with Raleigh down at the Friendlies. We had breakfast, started talking about what they had, and that began the plan with John Barrett joining us. And that's when I met John, when he came off the airplane. He didn't know me, I didn't know him, but he looked like the age group. And we went to the document center, and at a certain point, I think you had arranged we were going to meet in the courthouse with some people. And this friend that I met in '87, she was from the Nuremberg area. Was working in America, head of the language department at Hanover College, and she had about 15 students or 18 students with her. And they were first time out of America, first time where they could drink at any age almost. And she came to me one day and said, Warren, I need a favor. Well, okay. I need a little discipline for my students. Can you start going with us and be like the strong arm guy? I said, sure. So we traveled together. She had trips here, trips there, take the train. And I had told her about us going to the courthouse. And if you remember, there was a fellow that showed up. We didn't know who he was, didn't know where he was from. And the other people that were there, they didn't know who he was. Bridget was friends with the president of the university at Erlangen, which is just north of Nuremberg. She had contacted him, told him about what was going to happen, and they had a law school in that university. Somehow he passed the word, I don't remember the fellow's name, you maybe do.
I do.
Go over to Nuremberg at this time, on this date. There's going to be some people there, and I don't know what was said, but you can help them. Or anyway, he showed up, and you had that nice program with interns. I don't even know whatever happened to him. He's maybe still working.
Yes.
So that's how we got into the document center, and that's how we got into that individual. Now,
Just one pause while you're thinking, just to add some names there. The young professor from Erlangen was Christopher Safferling.
that's it. Now I know it.
And the senior guy who was brought there was a guy named Klaus Kastner, Kastner, and he had written a book about Nuremberg and Germany, so he was sort of the authoritarian person. So the young guy was Safferling, the old guy was Kastner, and then there was the judge, who I believe his name was Talbrick, Judge Talbrick, who we made the connection with, who was at the courthouse. And they brought all these people together, and if you remember, we then went back into the judge's chambers, and I actually did an interview with those guys. I mean, they didn't know what the heck was going to happen, but, hey, this is what I do. And sit down. I want to hear what you Germans think about Jackson. So it was the coolest thing.
Yeah.
And that was because of you. That all happened. And of course, the documentation center, which was a wow, that you've done the advanced work on. And then, of course, the craziness of all crazinesses is when we went to Firth and to where Jackson's house was.
Yeah.
And you and John, actually went next door. Tell that story a little bit, because that was crazy.
Well, at a certain point, we're in America, and you called me and said, would you ask your friend in Germany to find this address
33.
in Nuremberg? So I called Wolfgang and said, we're coming over, and we would like to go to this address because we believe that's where Justice Jackson stayed while he was there. And eventually Wolfgang called me back and said, there is no such address in Nuremberg. I have checked their records prior to the war, thinking that maybe the street was abandoned after the war. I reported that to you, and eventually you came back and said, well, have him check in a suburb or a city nearby named Firth. So I reported to Wolfgang that we had one more place for him to go look at, and he did. And I don't remember if he told us before we arrived that he had found the place, but at a certain point he said, I have been to the place that Jackson lived, and I went to that particular street and I had the address, but the house that I went to with that address had been built after the war. But I went up and I knocked and I spoke to the people, tried to find out if they knew anything about people that had lived around there after the war. And they said, no, but we're newcomers. We bought this land from the people who lived down the street. They may know something. So he went down the street. I don't know if he drove or walked. Very impressive area. Mm-hmm. Wall around the house where he was going to. And there was a driveway and there was a gate, so he couldn't just go in, but there was a doorbell on the outside of the wall, so he pressed the doorbell. And a lady came out and she said, Wolfgang, was machst du? And he says, Helga. He had played golf with her first husband. He was deceased, but they were friends. So he said, I've got these people coming from America, and they believe that Justice Jackson I don't know what, a man that was important to the Americans may have stayed in this house. And I wonder if you know anything about that. She said, yes, I know some Americans stayed here. And yes, I think he probably said, can we come over and talk at some point? She said yes. And we did do that. And by that time she had remarried. And we learned that at a certain point, the American said to her parents, out. We're taking over this house. It's a very nice house. There's security all around. And she said, my mother was pregnant at that time with me. And she prevailed upon the Americans to let us stay in the basement. Me in my mother's womb, and my mother just living. I don't remember anything about the father. And Justice Jackson did live there. And he worked there. And Wolfgang had all arranged we were going to go over. And I don't know that we knew we were going to have lunch, but they had prepared lunch for us. Very nice lunch. And I was surprised they didn't have a German beer. They had a Czech beer. Pilsner Urquell.
Memory, good.
And the husband was there, and I was the only person that was bilingual. He had, as his profession, a symphony orchestra. Mm-hmm. And he had a little over 100 people if you wanted to rent the whole orchestra, or you could have 10 or 20, I don't know how many. But he was talking about his music. He had a violin he brought out, showed it to us, talked about it, and at a certain point, lunch was over, and we sort of moved to another area and started talking. And you know, I'm getting tired. It's hard to be bilingual when you're not really not good in both languages. And you probably say, well, I've got some pictures of the area that we've taken. How about if I show some pictures? And you know that that trip included a trip to Bamberg, where you had heard somehow that there was a desk. Yep. And it may have been the desk that Justice Jackson had used. And I didn't feel very good that day. So I didn't go with you and John, but you went and you had the pictures back, and I had not seen them. Mm-hmm. So we're sitting around looking at your pictures, 1, 2, 30, 40, I don't know how many pictures. And then all of a sudden, in comes this lady walking. This is Helga's mother.
Yes.
There was a house behind the big house, and she was living in the house behind. And we learned there was also an underground passageway between the two houses. Mm-hmm. But she walked in, and we continued looking at the pictures, and then all of a sudden she said, in English, "That's my desk. Where is my desk? Where is my grand piano? The Americans took them." And I got to get us out of this conversation quick. So I don't know what I did, but we diverted her attention away from the desk. And I'm sure I said, "I don't know a thing about that grand piano." So we kept on with our socialization. And eventually we left. And eventually the desk got into America through help of a 3-star general at one point, I'm told, to get it out of the table of equipment of the United States Army. And we also got help from, I believe, Bush Industries to get it back at no expense. So that's how we got into a situation where we got confirmation that the desk in Bamberg was the desk that Jackson had used when he was living in Firth. And I'm sure that we did get permission somehow to keep the desk.
Phil, for the camera, this is for the camera, quickly. The reason we knew about the desk is Chief Justice Rehnquist was here in 2003, and it was broadcast by C-SPAN. A professor at St. Bonaventure was listening to it, and he said, "Oh my gosh, my son-in-law is in Bamberg, and he happened to be home on leave." And so the professor was talking to the son-in-law, and the son-in-law said, "Oh, by the way, we have his desk on the base." And it's just sort of sitting there, but it's his desk that we got from that house because the base division was the security for him. So they took a souvenir, essentially, when they took a souvenir. Brought it back to the base, and they said, so that professor called Raleigh, and then Raleigh called me, I called the professor, and of course we were going to go. I said, "Oh, by the way, we're going. Warren Erickson has set up this great trip, John Barrett and I," and next thing you know, we connected to the son-in-law, who then, got us on the base. And of course we got on the base, we saw that, and took pictures. And he said, "What are you doing with it?" And they said, "Well, there's nothing. It's just sitting in a corner. There's no big stand. It doesn't say Jackson. We just happen to know it. Can we get it? We'll send it to you tomorrow if we can get approval." That led to 2 years worth of problem. But the confirmation, to us it was a desk. And they said it was Jackson. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
But to go to where we were at that time, you may remember that the husband came out with a piece of furniture, It was a sideboard, or it was a piece of furniture which had a lot of decoration on it.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, he came out just to show, this is what was in the house, and it was a perfect match to the decoration that was on the desk.
Okay.
And we took a picture of that. Never telling them, of course,
Why?
And then you were absolutely, I'm so glad you mentioned it, because you diverted that conversation, because it could have gotten awkward.
Yeah, very awkward.
Because we wanted that desk, and we didn't want to tell them that they probably owned it, and the Army stole it, and you're not getting it back.
No. And that helped that I was not that good with their language.
Well, that saved the day, and when that story was done. And then, of course, you joined us when Bush Industries managed to pack that desk up like the Holy Grail. If you remember, when it came to the Jackson Center,
Yes.
Paul Fardink,
Yeah.
and he's the guy, Paul Fardink, who's retired lieutenant colonel. He's the one that got the 4-star general to finally approve it, because they were roommates at West Point.
Okay.
In that part of the story. So you got from a broadcast from C-SPAN, caught up at St. Bonaventure, talking to a son-in-law, who then gets us to Bamberg. You, Warren Erickson, get us to Bamberg. We get pictures of the desk. We then get it confirmed at Firth on Lindenstrasse, which is right, the house across the street, if you will. And that's the next thing you know, 2.5 years later, after a lot of red tape, we get it. You're there, we're there, and it's currently at the Jackson Center.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing.
It's the old story. It is such a small world.
Yeah.
I mean, I happened to make friendship with a man that had a friendship with the place where the house held the desk for I don't know how many years.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've told you, but Wolfgang told me that the family were Nazis. And I said, how do you know that? He said, well, they were in the business of making gummy bear candies, and that required sugar. If you were not a Nazi, you would not get sugar. Now, I believe that. I mean, I've read enough about Germany. If you weren't on the in-group, you were, if you're really bad, you're heading toward Auschwitz and other places. But otherwise, you just didn't live like other people. The Nazis took care of the Nazis. But some people, I'm sure, were Nazis because they just wanted to live. But anyway, that was another little dimension about that family. And they gave us a CD of music that his orchestra had played.
You're right.
And I lent mine out more than once. And one time it never came back. I don't know who has it. They've probably thrown it away. But it had music from television programs, the theme songs. Again, one guy walking around playing golf. And I went and met other people. And that's the best way I was told to learn German.
Yeah.
I would go to different places, and there's a bench. I'd sit down. Somebody would come along, and I'd start talking as well as I could in German. And most of the people enjoyed somebody was trying to learn their language. The lady that I met that had the connection with Erlangen, I also met her mother. Are you familiar with the expression that Sudeten Germans? Okay. There was an area in Czechoslovakia, a very substantial number of Germans had moved in there. Maybe,
The Sudetenland.
yeah,
Okay, yeah.
maybe 150, I don't know, 1,000, 200,000. And the Germans were not very nice to the Czechs, and they were doubly unnice to the Czechs after they took over Czechoslovakia in 1938. Well, when the war is over, the Czechs said, you Germans get out of here. that included Bridget's mother. And no McDonald's, no cars, no bicycles. She walked out of that part of Czechoslovakia back into Germany. Bridget was with her as maybe a 2-year-old girl. Her mother and her were put into a concentration camp by Czechs. And they got out eventually. They continued walking. Her mother's probably carrying her daughter, I don't know. They got picked up again and put into another concentration camp. And Bridget said, from what she was told, hardly any of the children lived. There was no food.
Yeah.
But her mother kept her alive somehow. Mother's a very attractive lady. Whew. I was in the Nuremberg airport one day waiting for Bridget. And I knew she was coming in. Her mother knew she was coming in. And I see this lady coming in. I mean, she's older than me. Yeah, a lot older than me. She's a really attractive lady. And then Bridget came off and she went over this lady. It was her mother. And then I joined them, and her grandmother and an aunt were there. We went and had coffee together. Last husband took me down into the basement and said, come on. He had a whole bunch of books. They had pictures of Nazi military personnel. See that person? Yeah. That's her father. Her father was SS. See that person? Yeah. That's your stepfather. He was SS. He was killed too. See that picture? Yeah. That's your uncle. He is saying that was her uncle. He was SS also. He got killed in the war. She's never told me about her family.